all once again. Is it fair? Well, sometimes we ask this question, don't we? Is it fair that during the lockdown, some places, but not others, are stay in the fuller lockdown for a longer period of time? Remember when we have the color coding, red zone, gray zone, green zone, all of that? Well, I live in Peel region, so we and Toronto region, we're the ones who are locked down, that had the severest lockdown measures. Is that fair? We ask that all the time. And then during the lockdown, different kind of retail operations got different treatment. So bigger box office stores like Costco, Walmart, they pretty much open the entire time. But the small boutiques are forced to close, even though they might be selling exactly the same things. Is that fair? Now, and then we come to the time where vaccines came in. But of course, we don't have all the vaccines all the time. So there are just stages, right? Who gets the vaccines first? And we started with the medical personnel, frontline workers, and then the elderly who are living in care homes. And then we went by age, essentially, right? The oldest first and going down. Well, is that fair to do that? Why would people who are older get an advantage over younger people, such as some of you over here? You have to wait for a long time to get the vaccine. So is that fair? So the question of is it fair comes up a lot. And today, when we look at this parable of the vineyard, Jesus told of this parable. This parable appears at first to be a question of, is it fair? Okay, so we've just read the passage. I have it here. I'll just quickly go through it. You don't have to kind of read it again, but you can look at it, or at home when you have the Bible, you can turn to it. I'll just highlight some portions, right? So this story goes like this. Jesus is comparing the kingdom of heaven like a vineyard with an owner. So this owner went out early in the morning, and here for the sake of clarity and context, early in the morning for Jesus' day, a work day starts at 6 a.m. So 6 a.m. he went out and hired workers for his vineyard and agreed to pay them a denarius for the day. Well, denarius is a fair wage for the day. And about 9 in the morning, he went out and saw others standing, doing nothing. So he invited them in and to work. And then at about noon, at about 3 in the afternoon, he's doing the same. So remember, it starts at 6. And then every 3 hours, he's going out, right? 6 to 9 to 12 to 3. And then the last one is at 5. Okay, so instead of 3-hour intervals, now it's 2-hour intervals. So it's 5 p.m. in the afternoon. He went out and found still others are standing around. So he's asking, well, why are you still standing here doing nothing? And they said, well, because no one hired us. Well, then he said, well, come in and work as well. Then the evening came. Now, what hour is the evening? Working backwards from the dialogue following, it's really 6 p.m. Okay, so 6 p.m. it's the end of the day. He calls the workers and get the foreman to pay them, and he's going to pay them from the last to the first. That means those who came in at 5 gets paid first, and then 3, and at 12 o'clock, and then 9, and then 6, so on and so forth. So that those who came in at 5, they got paid 1 denarius. Everybody else who saw this, they got excited, right? Because they were supposed to be paid only 1 denarius. But then those people who came in after them also got paid 1, and they felt, wow, we should be paid more, shouldn't we? And they're expected to receive more. That's what the scripture says. But instead, everybody got a denarius. Well, that got everybody mad, right? So especially those who came in at 6 a.m., they grumbled against the landowner, say, hey, those who came in 5, they worked only 1 hour. And you give them 1 denarius. We were here from 6, and we worked till 6. That's 12 hours. How can we be paid only 1 denarius, same as those who worked for 1 hour? We bore the burden of the work and the heat of the day. They came in at 5, and they got the same. That's unfair. But the owner said, well, I'm not being unfair to you. Didn't you agree to pay for a denarius at the beginning of the day? You did. And did I not give you 1 denarius? I did. So that's the end of the story, right? Take what you're given and go. I didn't do anything. I didn't wrong you. And then he said, don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous? And then there's a verse 16, by the way, which says, so the last will be first and the first will be last. Now, this is a very famous saying that Jesus says at various times in the Gospels. But this is the wrap up to this parable that Jesus said. So the last will be first and the first will be last. Now, that's the parable. When we look at parables, how can we understand a parable, right? Because in the Gospels, there are different genres, right? You remember that Matthew started with the genealogy. And then there were narratives of Jesus going around doing different things. And then there were teachings by Jesus. He taught. There was there were the Sermon on the Mount, starting from chapter 5 of Matthew, and so forth. And then he tells parables. Okay, so each of these genres in the Bible, if you want to understand it, you need to take the literary genre and understand it in its proper context. So for a parable, it's all made up, right? There isn't a landowner who's going out hiring people 3 hours apart and doing all of this and giving them what they're. This is fictitious. It's a made up story. Okay, so why does Jesus made up this parable, this story? It's actually to make a point. So the parable is all about finding the point. Well, what's the point of this parable? Okay. At first glance, as I said, this parable appears to be about what is fair. Okay, it doesn't seem to be fair. In other places, when I have more time, and I do a poll and ask people, do you think it's fair that everybody got paid 1 denarius? And then there are various opinions as to what is fair and what is not fair. Okay, but if we look at what is fair, or we use an interchangeable word to say equality, right? And equality is giving individuals who have the same task the same compensation. Okay, so if the definition of equality is giving the same compensation for the same work, then in this case, it's not fair, or it's not equal, right? Because people who work 12 hours shouldn't be paid the same as people who work 1 hour. Okay. But I think Jesus deliberately provoked this sense of unfairness to make a point. The key is, well, what is his point? What is his point? Well, first of all, when we look at this, Jesus is trying to pit kingdom values against worldly values, right? He started by saying the kingdom of heaven is like. Okay, he's making a point to say in the kingdom of heaven, these are the values that are there. And it's different from what you're used to. You're used to what the world says, but I'm now telling you something else. So while it is clearly unfair and there isn't an equality in the sense of equal pay for equal work, yet Jesus says, first of all, it is just. It is just. Now, justice or just refers to an action which is justified under the circumstances. Okay, so is it justified that the owner gave 1 denarius to everybody? The owner himself seems to think so, right? Says the workers grumbled, say, these who were hired last worked only 1 hour, verse 12. They said, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the work in the heat of the day. So what their argument is, it's not equal, it's not fair. But the landowner answered one of them, verse 13, I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do that with my own money? Right? So now, Jesus, who is behind this fictitious landowner, obviously, is pointing out, well, I've never said that I'm going to give equal pay for equal work, have I? I hired you, and there is a contract, a verbal one. When I hired you at 6 a.m., I said I'm going to pay you 1 denarius to do a day's work, which is implied to be 12 hours. And didn't you say yes to that? You did, right? You agreed to work for 1 denarius, and after a day's work, I give you 1 denarius. Well, that's justified. That's what we agreed to. That's the contract, right? And now if the landowner go out every 3 hours and hire more workers and promise them, I'm going to give you 1 denarius for the work of today, and he did so, well, then he isn't in any sense unjust, right? He had just fulfilled his contract and paid for the work that's rendered. So in this sense, it is just for the owner to give 1 denarius to everyone because that was the contract that was struck. And then secondly, not only is it just, but it's also equitable. Equitable. Now, we've got to be careful to distinguish equality and equity, okay? And we'll come to that a little bit later. Well, why is it equitable though? We must understand the context a little bit. Well, 1 denarius is the fair daily wage of that time. This is what you pay a worker. And now in this parable, it's obvious that these workers are day workers. Okay, they come out to work by the day and they get paid so that they can go and buy food and put it on the table for their family. Now, for those of us who live in privilege in North America, we don't quite understand this. You go to universities and you graduate and you get a job. You don't think about, I'm going to go out every day and look for a job and get paid for that day and then eat the food on the table until tomorrow, right? We never do that. But in fact, a lot of people around the world, even today, they are in that plight. So this first dawned on me about 2002, so almost 20 years ago, when I went on the short-term mission trip to Panama. So in Panama, there were a lot of Chinese who migrated from China, and they were typically restaurant workers or owners, or they work in or open a convenience store. So we went there and we talked to these Chinese and we tried to evangelize to them, and we go to the restaurant or we go to their convenience stores. So one time we were in the convenience store and kind of just talked to the owner. But of course, in between customers, right? Because we don't want to bother them when they're doing their business. And I was looking around the shelves and I saw this. I mean, there's a bag of rice there and a number of them on the shelf. And I'm like, why are there a small Ziploc bag of rice? The owner said, well, that's what the locals buy to eat. And I'm like, I have never seen this in Canada. We don't buy a Ziploc bag of rice. I mean, we typically buy this, right? You go to a big, Chinese superstore and you buy these like 25 pounds or whatever it is. Who would go and buy a small Ziploc bag of rice? This is obvious if you ever cook rice that this Ziploc bag of rice is only enough for a family of four for one meal, right? After that, it's gone. So, I mean, like if I buy this, I have to go back tomorrow to buy it, and I need to go back the day after. And every day I'm buying a Ziploc bag of rice. That's so inefficient. Why don't I just buy a 25-pound big bag? First of all, the big bag, when you divide up into small quantity, average price, it's obviously cheaper than the small bag. And secondly, saves me the trip. I don't want to go back to the corner store every day to buy a bag of rice, right? And I mean, sure, in North America, we have big houses, so we can store these big bags. But in most places in the world, maybe the housing situation isn't so great. So when I was a missionary in Germany, Germans have small apartments they live in. But even for Germans, they buy these packets. Like they don't buy small Ziploc bags. They buy these packets of rice that could eat for like a couple of weeks at least, right? So we don't understand. And then the owner starts to explain to us that, well, a lot of people in Panama, they're day wage earners. They only earn enough money that day to buy this small Ziploc bag of rice. They don't make enough money to buy a packet of rice, and they don't make enough money to buy certainly a 25-pound big bag of rice. That's all they can afford. That's why they keep on going back, because every day they must go and find a job to earn that day's wages. So here you can see on the left-hand side, That is in Central America. In Central America, there are a lot of day laborers. These day laborers, they have a waiting area. They wait to be picked up by owners who want day laborers to work in their fields. And typically, you see the lower left-hand corner, there are a lot of coffee bean fields, coffee fields, where the cafe beans or Tim Hortons beans, they all made mostly in Central America. So these day workers will just line up in the morning and wait to be picked up and work there. And not only in Central America, but on the right-hand side, the two photos, that's in India. That's in the state of Assam. Assam is known for tea. Lots of English tea that's grown in India and produced and then packed and sold, right? So in the fields of Assam, these girls are there, they're day wagers. They go in and they pick tea leaves. And it's literally exactly the same thing as what this parable is saying. People lining up in the morning waiting for a job. So the owners of the coffee plants or the tea gardens come and hire people as they need. Now imagine if you're left out, like you're in big trouble, right? If you don't get hired that day, you can't even afford that small Ziploc bag of rice for your family today. Your family, your wife or husband or parents or children, they'll be starving. They're waiting for you to come back with food on the table. So that is why this parable, in its right context, tells us so much. It's not about how much money the owner is given to the workers and whether it's fair when we put it on a scale. It's about why is this owner so compassionate to people who obviously have not worked enough in his own vineyard, right? So if it's unfair, it's not unfair to those who have worked 12 hours or 9 hours because they got what the contract says, but it's unfair to the owner. He's losing money by paying 1 denarius for people who work 1 hour or 3 hours, or only 6 hours. But he's willing to lose money because he's compassionate. That's what the scripture says. If I'm willing to use my own money and give him more, don't I have a right to do that? That's out of his compassion. Because the landowner didn't want these laborers who are waiting outside for a job at 5 p.m. to go home and not be able to feed the family. Obviously, he could have just given them 1/12 of a denarius because they only work 1/12 of a day. But that's not going to be enough to feed the children tonight. So the landowner is willing to do more and give more out of compassion. Okay, and his focus is not on what's deserved, but what is the need. There is more need for those who only got a chance to work 1 hour because they have not secured enough wages to feed the family tonight. And this is the point of the story, right? In the kingdom of heaven, God looks at our needs and supplies them according to our needs, not just what we deserve. So here's the difference between equality and equity. You see, equality means everybody gets the same thing. We're equal. So on the left side picture, these 3 men, I think they're men, they each got a box booster, right? They got boosted equally. And there's no unfairness there. But the results are different though, because if you want to watch a baseball game happening, the guy on the right, he's missing out. He's watching the fence, okay? Whereas on the right side picture, equity is about, in the end, what everybody gets, right? So instead of giving 3 equal boosters to all 3 of them, you give them according to the height that they have. So the person who's already tall enough to watch the game without a booster, well, he doesn't need it. Okay, the second one, the one in the middle, he needs 1 booster and he gets to watch it, and he got that. And then the shorter person on the right, he needs 2 boosters to watch it, and so you give him more. Therefore, they end up, all of them are able to watch the game, right? When you look at the parable, isn't that the case? If the person who's already worked 12 hours and he's guaranteed wages for 12 hours, he doesn't need another boost. He doesn't need to have 12 denarius. He needs only the 1. And that's the fair contracted wages. It's just and equitable. Person who worked 6 hours, now he needs a little help here because he's only got enough to pay for half of his family's meal. So he needs a greater percentage of mercy. But then the person who's only worked 1 hour, he's like the person on the right here, he needs a lot of mercy from God. He's getting 11 over 12 of mercy, right? Because he's only worked 1 hour out of 12 hours. He's essentially getting a booster of mercy here. But this is the difference between equity and equality, because what God is focused on is so that everybody gets to put meals on the table for their family and not how much they have worked. Okay, so when we look at this, then we begin to understand the parable and what it's championing. It's telling us the ultimate goal is to create a just and equitable world. The ultimate goal is that we all get what we need, right? Okay. So, and how can we get to this ultimate goal? Now, that is the question, right? Because even though in a perfect world, Garden of Eden, when sin isn't involved, when people always started at the same level playing field, there are no privileged people who are more privileged than others. There are no one who's more vulnerable than others. Then in that perfect world, equality equals equity, right? Because if we all start at the same place, we're all at the same height. Well, you just give everybody the same things and the results are the same. Okay, so equality equals equity. But we don't live in a perfect world. And because we don't live in a perfect world, then equality doesn't equal equity, right? So let's look at the realities of this world. The reality is what is happening in this world is the haves have more and the have-nots have less, okay? So it's not either equality in picture A or equity in picture B. It's the reality is the haves in the world have way more than they need, and the have-nots, they're kind of working out from a hole in the ground. Okay, how's that? Well, let's just look at the pandemic, what's happening. Since the beginning of the pandemic, every country is pumping money into their own economy to try to help. But because we all start at different places, the results are different. So for the G20, the haves, that's including Canada, right? The government economic stimulus is huge. Look at the blue dots. Okay. On the x-axis, it's the amount of money that's sink into the economy per capita, per person. Okay, you see how great amount of money that's put in there, right? And then on the y-axis, that's economic stimulus as a percentage of GDP. So the more higher the GDP is, the more you're pumping it into it. So everything to the right and to the higher y-axis, you see, that's all G20 countries. Whereas the orange dots, that's the sub-Saharan African countries. Now, these countries are have-nots. They don't have enough money. And because they don't have enough money, they cannot give so much to their own citizenry, right? So because they have not, then it's a vicious cycle of the people in these have-not countries, they cannot get as much as they could. So for example, in Canada, by November 30th of last year, the Canadian government have already pumped in 246 billion Canadian dollars to this economy. Okay, but the rest of the world, most of these sub-Saharan African countries, they can't even afford $246 billion combined. They don't have that money. And what's the result of that? The result of that is that global poverty has increased for the first time in 20 years. Now, this crisis has thrust more than 37 million people, that's as of the end of 2020 last year, back into extreme poverty. Extreme poverty is defined by the UN as earning more than $1.90 US dollars per day. Okay, earning less than $1.90 per day. Okay? You can do the math. That's probably about $650 a year. That's the wages. And people live on less than $600 a year, and that's by definition people in extreme poverty. So in the last 20 years prior to the year 2020, the extreme poverty levels have been coming down every year for 20 straight years. And then the pandemic hit. So in 2020 alone, extreme poverty levels have increased by 7.1%. And we haven't even started to count 2021 yet. And we haven't counted 2022 or 2023. Because despite the fact that in Canada, it will look like most people get vaccinated who wants to, and we might be coming out from the pandemic. For the have-not countries, WHO says that it might take until the year 2024 before the pandemic is over for them. So they will be trapped in this vicious cycle of poverty for the next 3 years. Okay. So what about vaccination totals? Well, once the vaccine was created, then all the have countries, the rich countries start to buy futures, buying future deliveries of these doses. And you can see the high income countries, they bought up 4.6 billion doses by the end of last year. Okay. And Canada is one of the top countries. You can look at this. Look at Canada is way up there. We bought about 338 million doses by the end of 2020. And that is enough to vaccinate our entire population 4 times over. Okay, 4 times over. But the have-not countries, especially low-income countries, they only get 670 million doses total. Okay, and remember that Canada ordered 338 million, just our small country of 39 million people, right? The low-income countries, whose population is about 20 times that of Canada, they only have 2 times as many vaccines allotted to them. Okay, so the WHO has a COVAX system in which they want the rich countries to contribute monetarily to buy vaccines so that they can distribute to poor countries. Well, they only have about 1.1 million doses, and they're still wanting more and more doses because the need is great. While Canada, today, you hear reports of more than 76% of our population is vaccinated for the first shot, and more than 50% or around 50% for second shot. A lot of countries, less than 3% of their population is vaccinated for the first shot. That's it. And they can't go on anymore. And they don't even talk about the second shot because there isn't a second shot coming. So if they can get 1 shot, they're really lucky. If they can get a second shot, they will be among one of our G20 countries. Okay, so that's a disparity between what's happening in the privileged countries versus what's happening in the have-not worlds. As we speak, this morning, one of my colleagues, our staff in India, his daughter, who just graduated from medical school and works as a medical intern, she has contracted COVID for the second time. The first time is about 2 months ago, and then she recovered. And then a week ago, she got a second time. It's suspected to be the Delta variant. And after 1 week, she's still weak and nauseous. And my colleague is texting me this morning to say, I'm seeing if this doesn't get better, we might have to see a doctor. But he didn't say to me, and I know for a fact, is the hospitals in India are overran, and if you go to the hospital, you better be very rich because they're not honoring any of the medical insurance that anyone has bought, right? They say pandemic is something that is not insurable. So even if you have medical insurance, like my colleague, we bought medical insurance for him, he and his family is not covered. If they go to the hospital, they have to pay a lot of cash for any kind of medical treatment or just to stay in the hospital. And my colleague had said previously, before his daughter was sick, that if any of his family got sick, they're not going to the hospital because they can't afford to pay at all. So that's the situation and disparity between those of us who are living in privilege and those who are living in the have-not countries. If we live in a perfect world where everyone is on a level playing field, sure, equality equals equity. But because of the imperfect reality that we live in, this parable teaches us that we need to take care of the most vulnerable first in order to achieve the ultimate goal of just and equality for all. Now, this is where the interesting interpretation of that last verse, verse 16, comes in. Jesus says, so the last will be first and the first will be last. There are a lot of kind of debates on how to interpret this. What does it mean the last will be first and the first will be last? One of the best ones that I've heard was, that means everybody's equal, right? So if we're equal, then you can't tell who's first, who's last, because we're all equal, okay? Which is true, right? If we're all equal, there isn't a first, there isn't a last. Remember when the disciples are fighting, I want to be, sitting at your left hand or right hand, Jesus. And that just means they want to be the first in line, right? They want to get to the top, climb up the ladder. And Jesus says, no, if you want to be the first, you have to be the last. You got to go and serve others. In fact, I do believe that in the kingdom, when we finally all go to the new heaven and new earth, everybody will be equal. So there isn't a last or the first. That concept is no longer valid. But as I said, we're not living in that kingdom. Right now, we're living in an age where the kingdom of heaven has arrived, but we're still living in this earthly kingdom, in this earthly world. And in the overlapping time, Jesus' parable tells us, what does it mean the last will be the first and the first will be last? It means those who are the most vulnerable, the last, they must be treated first. We must prioritize them. And those who are the privileged, the first, we don't need to prioritize them. They already got more than they need, right? So you see the parable, that's how it works, right? So the landowner has given more mercy and grace and compassion to those who have worked only 1 hour than those who have worked 12 hours. You can say that he didn't give much mercy and compassion to those who have worked 12 hours, except for hiring them, right? When they hired them, they agreed to work 1 denarius for 12 hours. That's what they got. They didn't get any extra. Everybody else got an extra pay, okay? And so the more vulnerable you are, Jesus is willing to be more gracious to you. The more privileged you are, you don't need to be given as much mercy. And this is how the values of the kingdom works. Now, so that's not fair. Well, that's not necessarily the case. Even in the kingdom of this world, sometimes we act out in this way, right? So imagine you're on a plane. I mean, whenever we can fly again. If you get on a plane, what's the first thing, before takeoff they do? They do the safety measures. And one of the things that they tell you is that in case of emergency, these oxygen masks will fall down, right? So you're supposed to pull it and put it around your mouth. And then they will say, but for passengers with small children, you should put the mask on the small children first before you put it on yourself. Why did they say that? Well, because the small children are the most vulnerable. They are not able either to reach it, or they are not able to understand how to put it on properly, or they might be stressed out. So as a parent or guardian, and as an adult, we should prioritize the little children who are most vulnerable first before we take care of ourselves, right? Right. We do that. That's an example of prioritizing the most vulnerable. And then in the vaccinations, we also see the same thing. Of course, we need to allow the frontline workers to be vaccinated first. Why? Because they are in touch of potential COVID cases every day. They are the most vulnerable. We're not. And we should give the elderly first, because initially the virus is attacking the elderly. Most of the deaths come from care homes, right? So naturally, we need to take care of those who are vulnerable physically to this virus first, rather than later on. Now, so even in our world, sometimes we already operate under this understanding of prioritizing the most vulnerable. Now, shouldn't we do that across the board, especially as Christians? Shouldn't we look around and say, who are the most vulnerable in our area, and think about how we can help them? Shouldn't we do that? Right? And it's this one example. At one time, I went to visit in El Salvador this church. It's an interesting church. And the pastor tells of a story of how she started this church. Well, in El Salvador, education for the children only goes up to grade 9. And beyond grade 9, you have to go to the cities and get into a few of those high schools. And then beyond high school to university, that's even more difficult because it's just not available. So most of the rural children, they drop out of school at the age of 12 or 13. And this is a big problem because gangs is a big thing in El Salvador. So the boys join gangs when they're 12 or 13. And then girls, they don't typically join gangs, but they get pregnant and become single moms because their boyfriends are a part of the gang, or they've been victimized by older men because the 12, 13-year-old out of school, they have nothing to do, just hang around their rural villages that often become victims. So there is this 18-year-old Christian girl who saw this and felt that God called her to do something for the children, especially for these preteens, so that they don't fall into this vicious cycle of going to gangs or become single moms at the age of 12 or 13. And then this girl, Jennifer, she decides what she can do is to evangelize, and she's going to hold an evangelistic meeting and prepare a meal before, invite the children to the meal, and then preach the gospel to them. Well, she had never been to a seminary. She didn't know how to do that. She just felt God called her to do that. So she went out and hand out flyers, inviting people, such and such a day, this time, come for dinner, and then they'll be meeting afterwards. Now, she thought, this is my first meeting. I don't know how many people will come. Like if I prepare food for 30, 40 children, that's probably a pretty ambitious plan, right? Because there aren't that many children. But then as the time comes, wow, there are a lot of children who are coming and some adults to come too. And then it's like 56 people. Finally, there were 100 children and 30 adults. She was like, oh my goodness, I only have this one bag of beans. Beans is the main staple in El Salvador. How is that going to be enough for 100 children and 30 adults? She was really like, don't know how to do it. Then she did the only thing she could. She kind of put her hands on the bag of beans and pray, God, help me to be able to feed these people with these beans. She's thinking of in terms of the feeding of the 5,000, that kind of prayer, right? And she cooked the beans and feed the people. It's a wonder it was enough for everybody. And then she preached the gospel, and then a few of the children came to Christ. And from that day on, she started this small church for children. And then fast forward till 16 years later. This is when I went and met, and this is the photo of 16 years later after that initial evangelistic meeting. And we visited. Her church is one of our partner churches. So there's me on the right-hand side. Beside me is our one of our Canadian missionaries working there. And then and her husband is to the left, the fourth to the left. You can see the tall guy in the back. That's our missionary. And then to the very left, this lady there, that's Jennifer. She was 18, and then 16 years later, that's her in her mid-30s. She's married with her husband, and they got a little boy. And now I said, no, what happened to your church now? She said, well, now the church has 40 seniors. And by seniors, she means people over the age of 35. And then 40 youth between 35 and 18. And then she has 280 children. So I do the math. Wow, that's 300, almost 370 people, 360, 370 people in her church. That's quite a sized church, but a church where mostly it's children and young people. And then she introduced her elders to us and said, here are elders of our church. And then we look around, where? Well, you see those two girls right in the very middle of this photo? Those two are her elders. She had elders who are ages of 21, 23, and 24. Like, oh, I mean, that's not the same as elders in our church. She said, yeah, but they're in the church the longest. These were the few children who have accepted Christ 16 years ago when they were children, and they grew up. And not only did Jennifer and the church, help nurture them in spiritual care, growing in spiritual terms, but They also secure scholarships so these girls can go to grade 9 above education and be educated in a university. They avoided that vicious cycle of gangs and pregnancy, and now they're contributing back to the church as elders in the church. Now, all of this happened because an 18-year-old saw the need in her community, and she asked God to give her the wisdom and the strength to do something about it. It is a remarkable story because it's how ordinary this girl, Jennifer, was. She's 18-year-old, no advanced education, is not trained in a seminary. Only thing she has is she saw the need of the most vulnerable, and she's willing to do something about it. So fast forward to us. The world's values is about equal treatment irrespective of context and circumstance. And a lot of times the world's value is, I need to get my rights and not think about others. But the kingdom value taught by this parable is that the ultimate goal is to have justice and equitable treatment for all. That's the ideal. And in order to get there, we must take care of the most vulnerable first. Now the question is, who's the most vulnerable to us? Who do we see them around us? And are we willing to take care of them first, like Jennifer did? Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for this morning, and thank you for your word. Through this wonderful parable, you challenge us, challenge our worldview, our values. In a world where we always talk about fairness, equality, and mostly we talk about our own rights, you challenge us to look around and see who are the most vulnerable. Look at, we are the privileged. We don't need more rights. We are the ones who God counts on to help the most vulnerable so that this could become a just and equitable world where the most vulnerable will get what they need. Help us so that we can look around us and see who are the most vulnerable around us, and to hear your call into action, to say, no matter what our circumstances, we can give something, and we're willing to do something for the most vulnerable in our community. In the name of our Lord, we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Reverend John.